Chapter 70 The Opening of the Red Cube. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The piercing sound, like a war siren, echoed to the edge of the dunes, awakening all life forms potentially asleep within 100 miles. Jake's group was no exception. Sadly, the child had also woken up. Given the circumstances, it might have been better if he had remained dormant. His first instinct was to ask where his mother was. None of the girls found the courage to tell him the disastrous truth. Unfortunately, the more they tried to keep him in the dark, the more agitated the child became, searching for his mother all around the camp. Weary and tired, Jake walked with a heavy step to the child, knelt down and hugged him. "I'm sorry," he said, apologizing with a neutral, uncompassionate expression. "It was already too late for your mother, but she didn't suffer." Having himself lost his own parents 20.2 years ago in the false Third World War, he knew that beating around the bush wouldn't do the child any good. On a planet where all kinds of aliens and digesters wanted to kill or devour them, preserving his naivete was as good as a death sentence. If he could recover and move on, he would have a much better chance of surviving despite the trauma. If the child was still too immature, stupid, fragile or stubborn to accept it, he would not last long. Surprisingly, and to the surprise of the rest of the group, the child began to cry silently, but stopped fidgeting around. Deep down, he already knew the truth. The reason the child had survived until then, where stronger adults had perished, was, besides his good fortune, due to an ether skill that he had acquired as soon as he arrived on this planet. As Aslael had explained to them, their etheric code had been altered and sometimes their genetic code as well. In order to increase the chances of survival of the weakest, children in particular were the most severely affected. This did not seem to be systematic and the reasons behind the awakening of one gift or another were not clear. However, one thing was certain. The talent obtained was never useless. This did not mean that all these talents were equal, though. The kid's ether skill was both extremely banal, but one that would serve him well until his death. He could sense danger. When his survival or the survival of those he cared about was threatened, he could sense it slightly in advance and extremely acutely. It was a sense of certainty that could not be ignored. A few days earlier, he had unwittingly led his mother to areas and positions that maximized their chances of survival. In the mall, he had not gone up to the first floor where the digesters were resting. Later in the forest, he had always changed direction slightly before the rest of the group reacted. Each time this spider sense was activated, its vitality, agility, strength and endurance would increase noticeably to assist him in reacting adequately to the threat. Because of his young age, he had mistaken this new sensation for fear, a lethal fear that was impossible to repress. And from a behavioral point of view it was a good thing. If the fear was less intense, he would have simply taken refuge in his mother's arms, but the sensations triggered by this ether skill would only intensify if ignored. When his mother had been captured, he had known that if he failed to get her out of the hands of the kidnappers, disaster would befall her. So despite all the red signals, he had thrown himself at their attackers to get his mother back, only to be knocked out miserably. When he had woken up to the piercing sound of the red cube this morning, he had woken up with a heavy heart and by not finding his mother his distress had only worsened. He was so weak, so small. Because of him, his mother had died in vain. If you want her to be proud of you, you shouldn't feel sorry for yourself. Jake declared, pulling him out of his melancholy black hole. Become stronger and survive to prove that her death was not in vain. Jake himself cringed when he heard himself saying those words. But sometimes a few cliched phrases were well worth a long speech. Hopefully, that would be enough to give that child the momentum of determination he needed to survive. So to get to the bottom of his idea, he handed the child his mother's turned-off smartphone, telling him that his mother's souvenirs were inside and that somewhere on B842, he might still have his father alive looking for him. Knowing that his father was probably looking for him calmed the child more than any condolences. Then getting up and patting the boy's shoulder to encourage him one last time, he went back to breakfast as if nothing had happened. He'd be lying if he said he didn't use his oracle device to find the right words. But he had done his best. An antisocial, unexpressive man like him was in the end the ideal person to announce heavy news. If an emergency surgeon were to burst into tears every time he announced the death of a patient to relatives, it would be excruciating. For that, Amy was grateful. She knew that she would have been unable to keep her cool in delivering the news and would have broken down in tears with the child. Since her arrival on this planet, she had felt on the verge of tears continually. Meanwhile, the hundreds of thousands of aliens had all risen up and were actively communicating, some of them through languages that could be learned by humans. Others, on the contrary, were chatting by exchanging all sorts of ultra or infrasonic signals, light impulses, pheromones, rattling or other obscure processes that Jake was unable to detect or interpret. The suns rose one by one, the sky tinged with red and magenta. The clarity was now sufficient to ascertain the situation of the other camps around him, and the first thing he noticed was that the layout of the different camps had completely changed. Not counting the group of criminals who had been all but wiped out except for their captives, Jake also discovered with amazement that all the males in the group of mud-colored-skinned primitive alien humans had disappeared, leaving only a group of frightened women and children. Some animal packs had also disappeared or were fewer in number. Even though he had not counted or memorized the number of aliens the night before at dusk, there was no doubt that they were much less numerous. At least 50,000 fewer. The huge lion that Crunch had joined was covered in greenish blood that wasn't his, a sign that the night had been extremely hectic for everyone, not just his group. As for his pet cat, it seemed to have grown again, starting to approach the dimensions of a small Labrador. His claws were abnormally long and sharp and his black fur was glossy. It seemed that the feline group it had joined was taking good care of him. At least on that side, he wouldn't have to worry. Compared to humans, animals seemed much more reliable to him. The only human faction completely spared at first glance was the group of knights led by Enya, the noble woman with long pink hair. Yet it was only an impression. 2 of the 20 elite ducal guards protecting the nobles were absent this morning, as were 3 of the nobles. Paradoxically, the normal guards in armor protecting the commoners had been untouched, which was reminiscent of the invincible alien of that night who attacked the camp of criminals by attacking only their leaders. If it was a similar monster attacking only the strongest who had assaulted them, then the people of this Enya were far more mysterious and dangerous than he first imagined. If his eyesight was any better, perhaps he would have noticed that most of the nobles looked terrible, as if they had just come out of a diarrhea several days long. As for Terry the farmer, he was able to find his wife unharmed once the criminals had dispersed. With the help of the digester blood, he had regained some of his strength, but his broken knees had begun to harden in a wrong position. He now needed crutches to walk. A few factionless humans had also survived despite the previous day's attack, either because they had fled or because, like Kyle, they had played dead by hiding in the sand. What surprised Jake even more was that Yerode and Lamine, the 2 leaders of the mercenary group, had miraculously survived. They were hiding discreetly among the factionless survivors with covered faces, although he would have recognized them out of 1,000. Lamine's sniper was impossible to forget. Apart from being covered in blood and in pitiful condition, they seemed to have escaped unharmed, without any compromising wounds. For the moment, Jake could not say with 100% certainty that he could have escaped unharmed from such a beast. After raising his stats, he hadn't really had a chance to time himself. He had no idea what his top speed was and how long he could hold it. But escaping from an alien sprinting at over 100 kilometers an hour would have definitely been an ordeal. Speaking of ordeal, the flickering of the red cube suddenly stabilized, the piercing sound that was attacking their ears stopping at the same time. Then, in front of a crowd of curious aliens, other life forms began to walk out of the cube by the thousands, as if it were nothing more than an intangible portal opening onto the Cyan Desert. Chapter 71 Cho Min Ho. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As if hypnotized, hundreds of thousands of living beings contemplated the newcomers gushing out one by one from a red cube higher than a skyscraper. The red cube, which until now had behaved like a mysterious, giant, multifaceted crystal, seemed to have liquefied, although it had retained its shape. Newcomers were escaping from it like dolphins jumping out of the ocean. A first wave of aliens, animals and humanoids of all kinds came out of the cube, haggard and sheepish, with no apparent wounds on their bodies. Yet the experience seemed to have traumatized them forever. They were the ones who had failed, and there were nearly 30,000 of them. Then, after a short interruption, a second influx of newcomers materialized. Those who had human appearances, or at least faces with recognizable expressions, were not as ashamed as the first ones. There were also all kinds of animals and aliens among them. The animals in particular were larger than their counterparts in the previous crowd. Generally speaking, all of them were mentally exhausted, but they seemed more seasoned, stronger, and mostly satisfied. This group was the largest, numbering over 100,000 individuals. At last, after another interruption, a third and final wave of people came out of the red cube. Compared to the previous groups, their eyes were proud and their faces serene. They all looked like they had something different from the previous groups. Obviously, they were the few who had shone brightly during this first ordeal. Humans, aliens and animals included, they were less than 1,000. Among the latter group, Jake saw a few humans but also, to his horror, 3 humanoid aliens like the one that had chased the leaders of the mercenary gang. Looking more closely at the previous groups, he found none of these creatures among them. This alien species seemed to be cut out to win. After the red cube had expelled all of the survivors into its bosom, it began to slowly flash again at the rate of a heartbeat. Meanwhile, each species in the different groups joined their own, with the 3 waves of participants blending together to form a large number of factions similar to those outside waiting their turn. Among the humans in the third wave, Jake recognized 3 Earthmen. He was almost certain of his inference from the typical Earth clothing they wore, as some of the brands could not be mistaken. The 3 humans were Asian, with a frail, extremely handsome young man, accompanied by another man and woman who stood close to him as bodyguards would. In fact, he didn't need to question their identities any longer, since Amy did it for him. It's Cho Min-ho. Amy gasped in amazement as she recognized the handsome guy in the distance. What? Sarah and Sophie echoed at the same time, with a startle. Who? Jake and Kyle yawned, not the least bit interested. Cho Min-ho, a Korean star who starred in several famous dramas in recent years. Amy patiently explained with stars in her eyes. I'm one of his biggest fans. Oh. Jake didn't give a damn, to be honest. The only thing he cared about this person was that he had obviously done very well on his first ordeal, despite his androgynous cowardly physique. With a bit of make-up, a dress and a wig, he could have passed for a woman. In view of the bodyguards accompanying him, it did not seem impossible to cooperate with others to increase his chances of success. Nevertheless, this was pure speculation, and it was quite possible that their appearance side by side was merely coincidence. Jake wouldn't underestimate someone based on their looks. Especially in a world where a few points of ether could completely transform a person via a good middle finger to the laws of physics. To Jake's great surprise, the majority of humans, including a few who were definitely not of Earth origin, gathered around him, some of them even kneeling before him. Like a good and benevolent king, this Cho Min-ho quickly helped them to their feet, before welcoming them with a big smile. The members of the first 2 waves also seemed to bond with the few conquerors who had just come out of the red cube. The same pattern was found with every species, alien or animal. Once the new factions were formed, the new arrivals departed in different directions, each time heading for an oracle city. The red cube was probably placed in the middle of 4 of them, themselves separated from 4 others by about 200 kilometers. The newly formed Cho Min-ho's faction did not immediately set off. Instead, they walked in their direction, or more precisely, towards the humans waiting to enter the red cube, of which Jake was a part. Once they were a few yards away and positioned between the 3 surviving factions of that bloody night, they halted. Cho Min-ho advanced elegantly, followed closely by his two bodyguards, allowing everyone to get a closer look at him. That Cho Min-ho had the typical look of a K-pop star. Handsome, trending mid-length haircut, wearing a comfortable branded street outfit. He had pale fair skin like a young girl's and hypnotic green eyes. His friendly face and smile had something angelic about it, but instead awakened Jake's suspicious instincts. From what Amy whispered to him with hearts in her eyes, he was the heir of one of the largest Korean upper-class families and already managed with an iron fist the many assets of his parents' commercial empire. He was apparently also known for his frail health and repeated absences during filming and press conferences for health reasons. Some said he had congenital heart disease, others that he suffered from severe asthma, or even cystic fibrosis. No one really knew the truth. His two bodyguards had nothing to do with the usual bulldogs in suits that most politicians and celebrities used to escort. The bodyguard to his left was a tall man, over 1.9 meters tall, in his 40s, with a slender but firm body reminiscent of a leopard. There wasn't a single ounce of excess fat. He wore a black Special Forces commando outfit with a bullet-proof vest, and all the gear that went with it, except for an assault rifle and other explosives. His weapons consisted of a gun, a long knife and a baton. He also had fairly dark skin, a sign of long exposure to the sun, and black hair plaited back with lacquer. That he could and wanted to comb his hair this way on planet B842 was a mystery in itself. His expression was extremely focused and alert, clearly showing that the safety of this Cho Min-ho was his priority. Nevertheless, Jake could detect in this person a certain smugness, often found in people of power. In comparison, the client they were defending was much more subtle and reserved. The second bodyguard was also a woman in full Special Forces uniform. Although she was carrying a gun and a knife like the previous guard, she also wore a katana on her belt, a sign that she was practicing a kendo-type martial art at a high level. Physically, she was a rather attractive woman of about 30 years old with a slender body and features and a small chest. She stared at them with a cold and stern look, including her client. Her long black hair down to her shoulders tied in a ponytail and her minimalist make-up contrasted with her company worker's impeccable hairstyle. Believing that he had got their attention, Cho Min-ho began to speak in a soft but resonant voice, betraying that he was a regular at public speeches. His body language was controlled and natural. "My presence among you is motivated by two things," he declared, while marking a time of silence. "The first is to increase the chances of success of my fellow citizens in this first ordeal in which you will soon participate. I will answer any questions you may have." Many murmurs began to buzz through the crowd of humans gathered in front of him. Some seemed eager to speak and ask questions. The Korean celebrity, however, did not let them do so, and beckoned them to calm down. "I'll answer all your questions. I have plenty of time." Cho Min-ho reassured them with a kind smile. "The other reason is that I'm recruiting." A new wave of whispers echoed among the humans listening to him, trying to find out what his true intentions were. They had all seen how members of the outlaw group were treated, especially women and children. Putting his life into the hands of a more powerful group they knew nothing about could easily backfire on them. The non-Earth human and humanoid factions occasionally had their own speakers, but not always. The faction of nobles and knights to which Enya belonged could only watch in frustration as other humans were getting information, while they were doomed to remain ignorant. Even with all their erudition and talent for magic, they could not understand a new language in such a short time. One of the nobles with hair as translucent as fiber optics could read people's thoughts, emotions and memories. Even without the knowledge of the language, he could understand the intention of the message. A skill he used in his home world to tame animals or extract information from victims against or with their consent, which could also lobotomize and manipulate. But because the ether on this planet was inaccessible to them, he had no way to renew his magic. Using what little mana he had to glean some information that might not be useful was too risky. As a result, the nobles stayed away and champed at the bit. Chapter 72 Recruitment Campaign. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It wasn't long before the first questions were asked. The humans remaining after that night were not the most belligerent, and therefore this question and answer session went off without a hitch. The first question was the one that everyone had on their lips. What exactly was the ordeal? The answer was predictable, but at the same time more complex than they expected. It's a test, but it's a long-term one. At least it was for us. Cho Min-ho tried to explain in clear and concise words. The red cube sends you into a world that is completely random, but one that echoes our culture, history, myths and legends. We were all sent to the same place, but I can assure you that the world you will be sent to will not be the same. The explanation raised more questions than it answered. Did these worlds exist, or was it some sort of video game that created a whole open world out of thin air? This was the second question he was asked immediately afterwards. I am incapable of answering you. The Korean star replied succinctly. The Oracle system will tell you the terms of the ordeal, your mission and the various conditions you will be subject to. On the surface, it sounds like a game. But once you get there, you won't be so sure. One thing that is true, though, is that you can't actually die in the first 4 ordeals. As you can see, we got out of the red cube in 3 times. The first wave of people were actually those who were killed in their ordeal. Which explained why all these people looked like crap and were disoriented. Dying, even for fakes, must have been a memorable experience if everything was or seemed perfectly real out there. The third question everyone wondered was, how long does the ordeal last? Again the answer was ambivalent. Well, it depends for whom and in relation to whom. Min-ho sighed, giving sympathetic nods to some of the members of his original group. For you on the outside, the ordeal lasted only 1 day. So we went into the red cube yesterday morning and came out this morning a day later. On the inside it's different. What's different? Someone dared to ask, while the crowd held its breath. For anyone who has passed the initial conditions of the ordeal, it lasts at least 2 months. The mission itself isn't particularly difficult if you don't make any major mistakes, but it's extremely painful. The first 4 ordeals are tutorials to prepare you for the real ordeals of tomorrow, and rightly so. You won't have time to relax. If you die during the ordeal, according to the information I've just gathered, you will exit the red cube along with the others who have passed, feeling as if you were killed just seconds ago. In other words, your body and your mind are out of time. And for those who succeed beyond the initial conditions of the ordeal. Another person, confident in his strength, asked with a strong African accent. It was Yerode, the leader of the mercenaries. Cho Min-ho and his 2 bodyguards spent a few seconds assessing the person in front of them. Among influential people, they knew how to recognize another leader when they met one. All 3 of them could sense that this individual was not a good person, with a lot of blood on his hands, but they didn't care. If you succeed in the initial mission, the mission can be extended. To what extent, I don't know. Several more months, it's possible. How long did you and your guards last? This time it was Lamine, the sniper, who asked his question. This answer. I refuse to answer it. Cho Min-ho answered with a slight smile, but his eyes were not laughing. Any other questions? The tension in the air was palpable. Despite his frail appearance, this Cho Min-ho was definitely tougher than he wanted to make believe. After all, he had come out with the 3rd wave. A long interrogation ensued, with everyone asking the questions that were on their minds. Cho Min-ho, his 2 bodyguards, and some of his allies took turns explaining the course of their ordeal, complimenting each other when information was missing. Apparently, the humans had found themselves immersed in a medieval world reminiscent of ancient England, in the midst of a conflict with a neighboring kingdom. Their starting points were often similar, but different at the same time. Some were part of the enemy kingdom, others were servants, slaves or recruits in training. Whatever role or identity they obtained, they were given the physical characteristics, skills and information necessary to fulfill their role. Depending on whether the participant was a child, a pregnant woman or an elderly person, the ordeal was always difficult, but within the participant's reach. The key point, however, that did not vary was that individuals in this world had an average ether level of 8 points, 2 points lower than unimproved earthlings. This ether level defined the difficulty of the first ordeal. It was obvious that this was not England or one of its conquered territories, but another world. The language was different, but they could understand it as if they had been born there, and the names of towns and villages were entirely unrelated with England's cities on Earth. Agriculture was more advanced, as was the water supply and sewage disposal system. The populations were also healthy with good standards of hygiene, far from the catastrophic dental situations and Black Plague-like epidemics of that period of history. The rewards of the ordeal itself were of course the knowledge, training, skills and craftsmanship acquired during this minimum 2-month period. For those who obtained a better rating, the rewards were unique and abundant. Cho Min-ho and his 2 guards refused to reveal theirs, but assured that they were worth all the effort. They were also warned that some claimed to have encountered monsters or been victims of spells or curses. Their ordeal was categorized as a medieval/fantastic ordeal. Many of those who had died and failed the ordeal had been the victim of a supernatural event. Hearing all these revelations, the audience responded very differently from one person to another. Fragile, vulnerable or fearful people, on the contrary, were discouraged, feeling helpless and powerless if immersed in a hostile world that would continually put them to the test. Most, including Jake, were initially under the impression that these missions would be relatively short, at least for the first ordeals. Others, including Jake again, were eager to take on the challenge. Yerode, Lamine and a few other humans were also determined to get the best possible rewards. Even Kyle, a big Vermorp player on Earth, was pretty excited. At least for the first 4 ordeals, the game over wouldn't be fatal to him and he could always participate in the next ordeal. His life would only really be at stake if he reached the 5th ordeal, which was a problem he wouldn't have to worry about for a long time. The last ones were hesitant, torn between the desire to become stronger and get the rewards and the desire to stay away from danger and difficulty. Cho Min-ho had naturally anticipated these behaviors by revealing all this to them. Now that all the questions have been answered, I come back to my second motive. That of recruiting. He abruptly changed the subject to the field he was in fact interested in. I would like to remind you that these red cubes exist in every Oracle city and shelter. If you don't feel ready, I promise to escort you to the nearest city, pay the entrance fee, and provide you with enough ether to make sure you're fully prepared. Jake frowned. It was a tempting offer for all those people who were scared or didn't feel confident about the chances of making it through the upcoming ordeal. As he scanned the crowd, he saw a lot of hope in people's eyes, but also hesitation and mistrust. If Yerode's group had not exploited or attacked all these people the night before, his recruitment campaign could have been a great success. What guarantee do we have that you're telling the truth, that we won't just be expendable pawns? A pudgy woman, a few months pregnant, dared to ask in a shrill fishmonger's voice. As if he was waiting for this question, the Korean star answered with a cordial smile, devoid of arrogance. Because anyone who joins my group will immediately be given 10 red crystals. The crowd gasped when they heard these words. For anyone who didn't even have the spine to kill a digester LVL0, it was an incredible amount of money. In addition, an ether wage will also be given to you if you serve me well. There are only 2 rules in my group. First, recognize my authority and orders as absolute. Of course, if one day you wish to leave the group, you will not be asked for any compensation, I promise. Jake snickered with disdain inside. Those last words were just empty rhetoric. If they really wanted to leave, he doubted it would be so simple after giving them so much. But he was one of the few who thought so. Most were just thinking about the present. If he really gave them everything he promised, why would they ever want to leave one day? The second rule is that you must give me 50% of the ether you make. Think of it as a social contribution. This ether will then be used to pay you, according to a salary grid that I will reveal soon. Of course, I will be subject to these rules as well. Those who thought they could obtain ether on their own gave up the idea of joining his group after this second rule was announced. But once again, Cho Min-ho had planned a parade. Don't underestimate such a rule. The stronger you are, the more you'll benefit from it. No matter how well you perform, how much ether can you get on your own? If this new organization ends up with millions of members, your salary in ether crystals could far exceed that amount. True enough. If this group gained enough members, they could set exorbitant salaries for those in the highest positions. In a world where might made right, those able to get a lot of ether on their own would undoubtedly be pampered. Joining one of these organizations in its early days would certainly be more rewarding than joining it later, when its power and hierarchy would be well established. So, anyone interested in joining my faction? When Cho Min-ho made his offer this time, the reception was completely different. A crowd of people rushed to him, shoving and jostling each other to join his group first and make a lasting impression. His recruitment campaign was a success. Chapter 73 Farewell. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Once the jostling and messing phase was over, a proper line was put in place, each person eagerly awaiting to receive their 10 ether crystals of welcome. Sophie and Loanna were part of this line. Very few people stood back, contemplating the mob of weak and fearful people so happy to have finally found a lifeline in the worst of their misfortune. Jake understood Sophie and Loanna's reactions after the night she had just endured. They were not made to fight. Especially Loanna, who had already lost the fingers of her left hand and withstood more than the nerves of a spoiled young woman of her age could afford to endure. Sophie was a nurse on Earth, and her skills were not to be disparaged, even on B-842. Digester blood did speed recovery, but some operations still required human intervention. There were bound to be medical personnel living well in Oracle cities who had never set foot on a battlefield. Jake was surprised, however, to see Amy nibbling her thumb, gnawed by an obvious inner conflict. She wanted to join Cho Min-ho's faction, there was no doubt about it. After a while and not daring to look at him because she felt guilty, she started to line up. She had found her way. Feeling his gaze and flushed with embarrassment, Amy still found the courage to come and apologize after a while, aware that she must have looked like a real ingrate. But to be honest, Jake didn't blame her at all. That she followed him because she thought she had a better chance of surviving was a credit to her. That she preferred to join a larger group on good terms and led by one of her idols was no more objectionable. In the end, they had only known each other for 2 or 3 days and their exchanges were limited to a few sentences. Their paths had only blended together for a short time before they quickly diverged again. If destiny so desired, they would meet again someday, or perhaps not. When it was Amy's turn to receive her 10 crystals and shake Cho Min-ho's hand, her expression made it clear to everyone that this was the most wonderful moment of her life, which strongly discredited the image of a capable and rational woman he had of her until now. Fanaticism, whatever its object or cause, made humans stupid. Terry, the farmer, and his wife Maria decided to join the Korean Star's fledgling organization, but it was a sensible decision. Terry was handicapped in his legs and absolutely incapable of performing well on his ordeal. As for his wife, after a night like that, she did not feel ready for further challenges either. Noticing that a few outsiders had chosen to stay away, his middle-aged bodyguard, with a body as sharp as a leopard, made his way to meet them. He went first to Sarah, who seemed torn between joining them and trying her luck with the ordeal. Quite clearly, she didn't care much about this celebrity and therefore only had to weigh the pros and cons between ease or freedom. As opposed to Amy and the other 2 women, that night had taught her that she could only rely on herself. By entrusting her safety to strangers, her life was flipped a coin. A Slayle had insisted on it. The good evolvers were respected, but those with the most prestige and privilege were certainly the players. Even if she could join this group and wait until she was more prepared to increase her chances of success, it should not be forgotten that the ordeal only lasted one day on B842, for at least 2 months of experiences with the certainty of surviving inside the cube. In 2 months, you could learn and master many things. Many people seem to forget that this new planet was dangerous, not only in comparison to the digesters, but in comparison to other aliens and humans constantly fighting each other in an evolutionary race. 2 months ahead, even with an average performance, it was impossible to catch up. By taking part in this first ordeal, she might emerge the next day as Jake capable of defeating entire groups of digesters. This would allow her to accumulate ether at full speed, increasing her advantage. If she joined Cho Min-ho's organization, she would be safe as long as no monsters or aliens superior to them appeared. On the other hand, she wouldn't get much ether. Even if their plan was to prepare them for their first ordeal, it would take weeks. Sarah didn't think she had that much time to waste. That's why, when Cho Min-ho's large bodyguard tried to recruit her in person, she made her final decision and refused. The bodyguard, far from being offended, approached her bracelet less than a meter away from her, before saying sarcastically, "Average ether. 10.4 points. That's not bad, but it's not enough. You're making a mistake by refusing our offer." "I'm sure of my choice," she coldly confirmed, then ignored it completely. "Since it's your choice, I won't insist." The bodyguard abandoned his polite tactics, then added, "My name is Kong Jun. If you ever join our group and serve me well, you'll be under my protection. Think about it." From the way he ogled her cleavage, it was not difficult to understand what he meant by serving. What made Jake cautious was that he was also able to scan their ether level. When Kong Jun came towards him, Jake took a step back, keeping a distance of more than 1 meter at all times. "Oh. You don't want to get scanned. That's interesting." The bodyguard then took a look at the client under his protection, awaiting instructions on how to proceed. His expectations were disappointed, however. His boss had no intention of creating a conflict for so little. "Leave him alone. If he wants to keep his information private, I have no problem with that. Everyone is free to decide their own destiny." Cho Min-ho answered him in a kindly tone, continuing to shake hands with the new recruits. The truth was that after the first ordeal, his oracle rank had been promoted to rank 4. With this promotion, the ether scanner unlocked at rank 3 had expanded its range to 10 meters. When Kong Jun's scan attempt failed, Cho Min-ho had crept up on them slightly, scanning Jake with his bracelet unknowingly. The values he read were alarming. Average ether. 21.4 points, highest ether value. 38 points. Even with the reward of his first ordeal and his ether skill that he was secretly hiding from everyone, his stats were barely higher. If Jake had gotten an average ether of 20 points, with his highest stats at 120, he would have known that the guy was just a moron having invested everything in strength. But if his highest stat was that low, then the man was dangerous. At no time did he consider the possibility that someone might have bet everything on intelligence or perception. It was impossible and stupid. As a precaution, the Korean star took the opportunity to also scan the other recalcitrant people refusing to join his faction. Will and Kyle would have been ideal recruits for his group. Above average levels of ether, and a willingness to evolve, but not a direct threat to his authority. However, when he scanned Yerode and Lamine, he broke into a cold sweat. Those two guys were monsters, capable of taking on Kong Jun and Lee Yoon one-on-one. How many digesters or aliens did they kill in a few days to accumulate so many ether? It had taken them a whole ordeal to reach those levels. Nevertheless, he wasn't worried. They had their ether skills and the rewards of the ordeal. They just needed to be patient while their organization grew and developed so that his ether skill could finally shine. The recruitment process lasted a good hour, during which Cho Min-ho handed out the ether crystals and continued to reassure and shake hands. His two bodyguards watched over those who had refused their offer, and the other members of his faction welcomed their new comrades. Of Jake's original group, only Will, Kyle, Sarah, and the child named Tim remained with him. With the exception of Will, who had followed him from the beginning, who would have thought that they would be the only ones ready to enter the red cube with him. Life was full of surprises. Once the recruiting phase was over, Cho Min-ho said goodbye to those who refused, reminding them one last time that they would find him in the Oracle City in the East if they wanted to apply in the future. Amy, Loanna, and Sophie bid them farewell, both relieved and embarrassed to abandon them at the crucial moment. There was no guarantee that they would meet their friends in the ordeal world, but the fact that they were entering through the same red cube ensured that their starting points would be close. The one who performed well could definitely help his allies to do well too. Amy seemed to want to add a few words, but finally she abstained and left in silence with her two friends. She was not ready for the ordeal, but she would not forget to whom she owed her life. After the departure of all those aliens and humans who had been recruited by the victorious factions of the ordeal, the cyan sand dunes around the cube had cleared considerably. Jake could again make out the pride of felines led by a giant lion that his cat Crunch had joined. Crunch came to him one last time, rubbing his leg while purring. He also ate one last bowl of his favorite kibble before returning to his new feline friends. They would not see each other again until after the ordeal. Jake then turned his gaze to the gigantic ruby-colored cube towering over them with apprehension. It was their turn to enter the structure. It was time to face the unknown, and overcome the ordeal that the Oracle had prepared for them. Failure was not an option. Neither was simple victory. He had to be the best. Seeing the determined and eager eyes of Yared and Lamine, he knew it would not be easy. Among thousands of Earthmen, fighters like these, there were bound to be many more. And yet, it would be up to him to surpass them. Chapter 74 The First Ordeal Begins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Now that the dunes had emptied, the most fearless aliens began marching towards the red cube. In a matter of minutes, thousands of aliens clustered around the huge structure, suspiciously staring at each other. Everyone seemed to be able to enter the red cube according to Cho Min-ho's words, but they still needed to start the ordeal in one piece. Not all of these aliens had been lucky enough to have an alien of their species having participated in the previous ordeal. If they believed that they were all competing with each other, it would be natural to show some hostility. As a result, Jake and his group had no intention of entering the red cube first, willingly leaving the lead to the more reckless or stupid aliens. As Aslael had explained to them a few days earlier, the first 4 ordeals were between similar species. So in principle, there would only be humans in this first ordeal. Nevertheless, if an alien species was genetically similar enough to be recognized as a race, or a different phenotype for those who believe this term to be racist, the possibility existed that they would be shipped to the same world. Jake doubted it, however. At least for the first ordeal, he was confident that there would only be Earthlings with them. At least, if there were other human species, they would be sent to different areas or their interactions would be kept to a minimum. There was another revelation from Cho Min-ho that had also greatly disrupted his plans. According to the scenario and identity planned by the ordeal, their equipment could be confiscated from them. There went his plan to load liters of digester blood in case something went wrong. As the first 4 ordeals were considered tutorials to prepare them and increase their chances of survival in the mirror universe, the risks were much lower and the objectives simpler. On the other hand, the restrictions were significant. This was to prevent the strongest from spoiling the ordeal of the weakest. Possession of a gun in a medieval world would destroy the formative purpose of the ordeal and could seriously disrupt the normal course of it. It might not be obvious to everyone, but the ordeal could also put them in competition with the other participants, but that was not the primary goal. The main mission was always individual, but the way to accomplish it could vary endlessly. The only thing he could count on once he made it there would be his oracle device and his ether. With his loot from last night, he had again accumulated 21 points of ether, which could be considered his trump card in case of unforeseen circumstances. There was also a good chance that Tim would be sent somewhere else, given his young age. So would the elderly. Women were also reported to be subject to different treatment, but this depended on the cultures of the world to which they would be sent. Meanwhile, the most powerful and numerous alien factions had begun to squabble over who would have the honor of entering first. For the first time, he realized that the Earthlings were factually pretty stupid. The overpowered humanoid alien who had pursued Yerode and Lamine was uttering a deafening wail sound, while its interlocutor in front, a huge, multicolored soap bubble the size of a man, was babbling a cloud of bubbles without Jake being able to tell whether it was calm or angry. But the most surprising thing about all this was that they understood each other smoothly, in a way that eluded him. He could see them pausing between communications to translate and digest the messages exchanged, before speaking once again. The diplomatic approach between these two super species ultimately failed. Losing patience, the thousands of luminescent dendrites of the humanoid alien pierced the bubble, cracking like a whip. The soap bubble then burst with a loud pop before immediately reforming itself, albeit slightly smaller. It returned to normal size after a fraction of a second. Enraged, the bubble suddenly swelled to the size of a two-story house and then abruptly condensed to the size of a marble. The bubble spoke again, releasing another cloud of bubbles. But this time, instead of carrying a message, they exploded by depressurization when they reached the alien opposite. Boom! A noise similar to a chain reaction of firecrackers exploding one after the other resounded at the foot of the cube, blowing away the curious spectators with the force of a tornado. Those far enough to avoid being blasted, but too close to escape unharmed were completely knocked out, their eardrums, if they had any, bleeding enough to feed a family of vampire. As for the target of the explosion, it survived by barricading itself behind its dendrites, but it had to be said that many of them were now much shorter. A new wave of discussions then ensued, the exchange this time being much more courteous. Lower species such as humans could not but stand aside in the face of such a display of power. Who knew that a simple bubble could be so devastating? This confirmed Jake's decision to enter the red cube at the very end. It did, however, raise new concerns. The first 4 ordeals were between humans and their survival was guaranteed. But what about the 5th and subsequent ordeals? Could they compete against this bubble and this alien with thousands of dendrites? At equivalent ether, humans were too weak to compete against these monsters. If ether density was the only criterion deciding the world chosen for the ordeal, he'd run into these aliens sooner or later. The two monsters in question, by the way, seemed to have finally come to an agreement. They entered and disappeared inside the cube at the same time, like pebbles falling into a pond. Then followed their comrades, and then the other dominant alien species. After a good half-hour of jostling and small fights that didn't kill anyone, only humans and other primitive species remained. Even then, Jake let the impatient ones pass, only walking towards the red cube when only his group and a few other stragglers were left. When it was his turn, he gave his teammates a final recap, wishing them good luck, before entering the cube with a determined stride. Contrary to what he imagined, he felt no resistance, no sensation of liquid or viscosity. It was as if the gigantic red cube was in fact just a hologram. However, when he wanted to step back out, he found nothing but nothingness. The inside of the cube was pitch black and silent. He could no longer feel his body when he tried to touch himself, and he could no longer hear his voice when he tried to speak. To be frank, he was no longer breathing and did not feel the need to. He wasn't even sure he had a body. After a long time that felt like forever, with only she and his dreams for company, information finally appeared in his mind, coming from his oracle system. Participant: Jake Wildearth, Earthling. Successful ordeals: 0. Awaiting matchmaking for first ordeal. Species allowed: Earthlings. Matchmaking complete, first ordeal determined. Type: historical. Peplum/fantastic, ether density. Asterisk 0.8 or 8 points, number of participants. 8,658,435, background. The Mermid Empire and its people. The Myrmidians believe they are the descendants of the hero Mermid the Great. They see all other people as inferior beings, only fit to be their slaves. They are a warlike race. The Mermid hero's blood that flows in their veins makes them stronger with every victory under certain conditions, and weaker in defeat. To become stronger and satisfy their desire for conquest, the Myrmidians are at constant war with neighboring kingdoms and lands, plundering and pillaging the resources they need to thrive. The most valiant enemy warriors are enslaved to fight in their arenas, with the promise of one day gaining their freedom and being blessed by Mermid the Great if they prove their worth. The Thracians, a barbarian people at war with the Mermid, were recently defeated in the Mermid Empire's final campaign against the barbarian peoples of the north. The war is still raging, but they are constantly losing ground, though fiercely resisting. Each defeat leads to the Mermid Empire's acquisition of many prisoners, who are then sold back to the highest bidder by appointed slave traders. In this ordeal, you will be one of those newly captured Thracian slaves. You await your fate in a dungeon of an insula in the coastal city of Heliodas. Main mission. Survive 2 months. Penalty for failure. None. Benefits and specifics during mission time. Mermid and Thracian's language mastery, altering the appearance to look like a Thracian. Blessing of the hero Thracian. Sturdy body equals strength plus 10, vitality plus 10, constitution plus 10, perception plus 3, may fate work in your favor. Hardly had Jake finished reading and memorizing all these data that a bright ruby-colored light blinded him, engulfing his whole being and consciousness in the process. When he awoke long afterwards, the smell of urine, sweat and feces attacked his nostrils. He was in a dungeon, the smell inside was nauseating, his tongue and lips were parched with thirst and his stomach was crying out for food. The first ordeal had begun. Chapter 75 What It Means to be a Thracian. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Jake opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was that he wasn't alone in his cell and that it was dark. The sun had just risen, but apart from a tiny dormer window with bars that let in a bit of light, it was pitch black. Surprisingly, he could still see clearly. About 20 other prisoners were waiting to be disposed of in the midst of their waste. Most of them were still sleeping. By scrutinizing carefully, he finally recognized with great difficulty next to him Kyle and Yerode, the leader of the mercenaries. Why with difficulty? Because their appearances were somewhat different now. In addition to the dirt that covered them, their almost naked bodies except for a loincloth were also suffering from advanced dehydration. Nevertheless, that was not what made their identification so challenging. Their hair was now snow-white and their bones had been visibly altered. Even Yerode, who was of African descent, had much paler skin now. Instead of thin and slender features, Kyle now had a wide manly jaw and the build of an American footballer. Their arms were slightly longer, their hands and fingers wider. Their forearms and biceps were more massive and their legs were slightly shorter. Their noses were also longer. All these details did not profoundly change their appearance and they could easily recognize each other without any possible confusion. However, it was confusing to see such a change in such a short period of time. Raising a huge hand in front of his face, Jake was able to confirm that he had not been exempted from this treatment. He also realized that one hand could not be moved without the other. He was handcuffed. As he tried to get up with difficulty, a resistance and the rattling of chains prevented him from completing his motion. He also had irons on his ankles and his ankles were connected by a chain to 2 other prisoners. Yerode and another guy. They were stuck together for better or worse. Yerode, who was also awake, growled as he was pulled by Jake's brute force. "I swear, if you keep pulling on your chain, I'll kill you on the spot." The African mercenary threatened him in a very bad mood. First he woke up in the middle of a cell covered in urine and feces, and now he had to put up with being chained to a crazy idiot. Bad luck for him, Jake wasn't the sociable type either, and certainly not in a good mood either. Pulling with all his strength with his leg, Yerode, taken by surprise, swung forward to land headfirst in the half-dry feces of a former prisoner or long-gone slave. His arms were handcuffed together and he hadn't been able to catch himself properly, and some of it ended up in his mouth. Cough, cough. You're a dead man. Yerode uttered a war cry, completely enraged. He hadn't been humiliated like that since his military service in Kenya. In response, Jake took a step backwards with all his might, making the mercenary who was still four-legged in a pseudo-plank position slip again. He regretted his action, though, since after that Yerode bumped into him head first, sending him to the ground in turn. Falling on his back, he couldn't use his hands shackled at the front to catch himself, and consequently felt a compact substance of dubious content splashing on his back when he landed on the ground. Furious too, Jake slammed into him in turn, sending him flying back against the stone wall. After that, the two brutes went on with a series of Greco-Roman wrestling holds, punching and kicking each other viciously when they found an opportunity to do so. Jake had not forgotten to whom they owed their group's attack the night before, and therefore did not hold back his blows at all. Yerode, who had no idea who this madman was, had simply decided that he hadn't lived like a tyrant for 2 decades only to be humiliated by a greenhorn 10 years younger. The fight went on for a long time before footsteps forced them to interrupt their score. Settling session. By tacit agreement, the two men sat back down against the cold stone of their cell, once again simulating the behavior of lethargic and dehydrated prisoners. The noise of their fight had awakened almost everyone in their cell, and everyone was staring curiously at them. If for Jake and Yerode it was just another fight, for the spectators these two bullies were more terrifying than two ferocious hungry beasts. The alteration of their appearance, combined with the blessing of the hero Throstian, had transformed their already hardened physique into real killing machines. The impact of each of their blows made a resounding sound and their endurance seemed inexhaustible. As for their speed, they were like two jackhammers trying to puncture the other. Even after their terrible fight, they were barely bleeding and no apparent bruising covered their bodies. Despite the violence of their confrontation, no vital blows had been delivered. Jake may have been less experienced than Yerode, but he made up for it with a superior constitution and vitality. Yerode's forte was his agility and constitution, for like Lamine, he excelled with a gun. His physical strength was barely superior to Jake, which was not enough to compensate for the latter's advantage in vitality. Finally calming down and catching his breath, Jake had realized after this fight that the hero Throstian's sturdy body blessing was completely different from what he had originally imagined. The bonuses of vitality, constitution and perception had not inflated his ether stats, but his body status. The transformation of his appearance into a Throstian also seemed to emphasize stamina and toughness. As a result, he was left during the ordeal time with a body that was unlike the one he had before entering the Red Cube. His body status had changed profoundly. The changes were not limited to a simple vitality plus 10, constitution plus 10 and perception plus 3, but his stats were now compared to the average Throstian. Height: 1.81 meters, plus 0.05, weight: 82 kg, plus 15, strength: 19.3, plus 20, points. Agility: 15.5, 0.2, points, constitution: 19.2, plus 20 plus 10 is equal to plus 30, points, vitality: 19.6, plus 10 plus 10 is equal to 20, points, intelligence: 16.1, 0.3, points, perception: 11.6, plus 5 plus 3, points. Upon discovering his new physical stats, he cursed. No wonder he got so easily carried away with Yerode. He had literally lost over 30 IQ points during his physical alteration into a Throstian. By consulting the vital parameters of his status, he found that his testosterone levels were more than 10 times higher than those of a normal human and his cortisol was abysmally low. Testosterone was the dominance and aggressiveness hormone found in men and women of power. An excessively high dose was correlated with increased aggression. Conversely, a low cortisol level betrayed a strong resistance to stress or a relaxed state and was generally inversely proportional to testosterone. Simply put, in both humans and animals, individuals were generally dominant and fearless, or submissive and stressed. Such abnormal levels associated with his declining intelligence explained his eagerness to fight for dominance against Yerode, even though it was exceptionally stupid and counterproductive in their situation. Yerode had also realized the problem with their actions and now looked gloomy. Unlike Jake, he had never been a particularly gifted genius. His good decisions were based on his composure and experience. With his new intelligence stats, he was now slightly retarded by Earth standards. Had he not invested 1 ether point in intelligence a little earlier, he would have been severely handicapped. From the confused expressions and foolish looks of the other prisoners, they all suffered a severe drop in IQ. Kyle was a student at the university and Jake could only pray that his intelligence had not fallen to too critical a level. Luckily for him, the playboy was still in his right mind and with a nod he confirmed that he was fine. Jake was unsure if the other Throstian slaves in their cell were participants in the ordeal, but at least 2 of them had lost their minds, behaving like 2 not-so-smart gorillas. Jake, Yerode and Kyle were wondering what the point was of reducing their intelligence in this way for an ordeal that was supposed to prepare them to survive in the mirror universe. Unfortunately, they would have to deal with it. Meanwhile, the footsteps had stopped a few meters from their cell. A man dressed in an outfit similar to a Roman legionary opened the rotten wooden door of their cell with a large, rusty, old-fashioned key. He was wearing a bronze breastplate, a navy blue tunic down to his knees under his armor and a pair of sandals. A glaive was also stored at his belt. An open helmet made it possible to distinguish the face of their jailer. The man was young, less than 30 years old, but there was a cruelty and viciousness in his face that even Yerode could not match. His nose was crooked, his complexion grayish and his teeth yellow. Jake could not help praying for the Myrmidians when he saw this man, hoping for them that this soldier was not the finest specimen of their kind. Chapter 76 The Thermal Baths. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Everybody out, and get your asses out there. Their jailer started yelling at them, sputtering like a sprinkler. The language he was speaking was totally foreign to them, and yet everyone understood his words as if they had been practicing that language forever. Seeing that most of the prisoners were too stupid or haggard to obey, he called for some guards and with the help of biting whiplashes instilled obedience in them. The Throstian slaves, whether participants in the ordeal or not, were mostly too weak and dehydrated to respond promptly, and the slower ones were whipped a good 10 times before they found the strength to stand up. Connected to each other by the chains at their feet, the latecomers were in fact holding the whole group down. Once in line, the jailer and the guards assisting him escorted them silently by the sole glow of the dungeon torches, stopping from time to time in front of another cell to fill their rows of slaves. In the 3rd cell, Jake came across an exhausted and disoriented Will. His face lit up when he recognized Jake and Kyle. Thank God he had not lost his mind when he was transformed into a Throstgenian. Yerode found Lamine, who, despite his weakened state, looked rather relaxed and composed. Just the opposite of the night when he had been pursued by the dendrite alien and ended up in a pathetic state. Without a word, those who recognized their friends or relatives lined up near the ladder without making waves. After crossing a long corridor and emptying a dozen or so cells, their jailers suddenly changed direction and headed for a large barred door separating them from a large staircase. Another legionary, standing guard outside the dungeon saw them coming, grabbed a heavy key hanging from the stone wall behind him, and hurried to open the gate for them. So far, except for the first jailer, who was hideous, the other guards looked like perfectly normal humans. Once the gate was opened, the slaves and their escort walked up a staircase of about 30 steps, the daylight attacking their pupils accustomed to the darkness when they reached the ground floor. A last iron gate separated them from a large open courtyard similar to a patio. Once lifted up, the slaves discovered basins and fountains decorated with marble statues reminiscent of those of antiquity. In the center of the courtyard was a 3-meter-high statue of an abnormally muscular, naked man with a spear and shield. Possibly the hero Mermid whom they worshipped. The slaves were then taken to another adjacent building. The architecture was very Greco-Roman in design. There were many marble pillars supporting and harmonizing the structures. Mosaics on the walls and bust or integral sculptures of all sorts decorated the corridors they passed through. Pretty maidservants with exotic looks could sometimes be seen not far away, carrying fruit trays or busy cleaning the house. But Jake was too preoccupied with his own thoughts to pay any attention to them. The transformation of their bodies into Thrasgenians had significantly reduced their intelligence and exacerbated their aggressiveness. No matter how he looked at it, he saw nothing but drawbacks. Yet this first ordeal existed only to prepare them as best they could be to survive in the mirror universe. So there was naturally a good reason for it, and there had to be some advantages to it. The important gain in strength, constitution and vitality was obvious and their usefulness was clear. Even an elderly person or a child had a good chance of being able to endure heavy loads of training or physical abuse without ending up handicapped for the rest of the event. The fall in intelligence, on the other hand, was clearly deleterious. Jake, for example, thought he could use the ordeal time to learn as much as possible and develop his martial skills. The drop of 3 points in his intelligence meant that his memorization and understanding would be significantly affected. Any learning would require twice as much effort for half the result. He would also need more reminder shots so he wouldn't forget what he had learned. He who had reached 180 IQ with his 2 statuses now found himself with his initial intelligence or almost and was experiencing it like an arm amputation. He felt like a fog was clouding his reasoning and it was much harder for him to focus. So what were the benefits of such a penalty? Jake only saw 2. 1. To make everyone understand the critical importance of intelligence. Humans being arrogant, even idiots often thought they were right, never thinking they were inferior to those intellectuals who were more learned than they were. It was easy to favor other less expensive ether stats such as strength or agility by thinking that one was not so stupid and that more intelligence would not be much use to them in order to survive. What better way to realize the importance of intelligence than to be deprived of it? Those who were not so clever already would probably spend most of the ordeal in a state close to that of a chimpanzee. If, by some miracle, they were to succeed with their ordeal, it would be a memorable lesson they would not soon forget. The second reason Jake considered was that too much intelligence or caution could be counterproductive in this ordeal. If, for example, a fearful scholar broke down emotionally or refused to fight because of fear, turning him into an extremely aggressive brute would certainly help him to overcome his psychological blocks. Just as everyone would remember what it meant to live like an idiot, fearful thinkers would remember the permanent boldness and rage that had once inhabited them. Aggressiveness and fearlessness could also benefit them in certain areas, including fighting. Every martial arts club has its share of talented practitioners, but too fearful to really evolve beyond a certain level. They would retreat too much, close their eyes, or make too many counterproductive movements out of fear. This type of reflexes coming from the reptilian brain was not so easy to overcome. All naked and faster than that. Throw the rags you're wearing in the basket next to you. Someone will come and get them. Their jailer's tyrannical orders abruptly pulled Jake out of his inner monologue. Inside the building into which they had been taken, many wooden latrines, basins and tubs filled with water awaited them. Unknown flower petals covered the water in the basins, giving the place a fairy-tale atmosphere. They were also provided with sheets of soft soaps made from plant ashes. Even though Jake was a self-respecting anti-social person, the experience of the previous months combined with his transformation into a Thrasgenian had completely erased any sense of prudishness in him. Apart from a few rare exceptions, no one resisted this order. In any case, it made very little difference. Apart from their old loincloths stinking of piss, most of them were already naked. Jake was no exception. At least he didn't have anything physically to feel ashamed of. His body was well proportioned and athletic, and his manhood was imposing enough. Nevertheless, whether some of them had a maggot or, on the contrary, an elephant's trunk didn't loosen up the atmosphere at all. The unfortunate moron who laughed nervously at his neighbor was immediately rewarded with a whiplash to the crotch. The cracking of the whip, followed by a heart-rending scream, reminded them all that they were not there to have fun. One by one, they undressed and entered one of the basins, actively rubbing themselves with the plant soap. While they were washing, a second group of Thrasgian slaves entered the building. They were all women. Unlike the Thrasgenian males, the females had more slender features. Their hair was also white, their skin pale and their bones thicker than those of the average earthling. Without warning, the jailer who brought them here asked them to undress too, while licking his lips with a perverse expression on his face. The resistance of the female slaves was this time stronger, and very few obeyed this order on the spot. These slave traders were, unluckily for them, absolutely non-sexist. A few merciless lashes of the whip soon made them comply. A moment later, all the naked women joined them in the baths. A deathly silence reigned in the baths throughout their ablutions. The decline of their intellect combined with their absurd levels of testosterone and estrogen made them all sexually aroused. The presence of naked members of the opposite sex acted like a Viagra pill on their bodies, and soon all that could be heard was the shortness of breath of rutting men and women holding back their impulses. A few whose intellect had been severely diminished were unable to control themselves and began fornicating on the floor in plain sight. Far from intervening this time, the guards watched the show mockingly, commenting with their dirty jokes how primitive these Thrasgian slaves were. With this visual stimulation, the situation quickly degenerated into a veritable orgy. Jake, Will and Kyle, from beginning to end, washed themselves silently, calmly staring at those who, like themselves, remained stoical in the face of this scene of depravity. Meanwhile, Sarah had snuggled up with them, finding herself alone as a naked girl in the midst of three men. And yet, she had never felt so safe. Kyle was undoubtedly horny, but Jake and Will were two walls of ice, watching their surroundings like two birds of prey. To her perfect body, they didn't give a single glance. Embarrassed and somewhat offended by her lack of charm, Sarah, all red, had to resolve to wash herself silently in turn. All the while, moans of pleasure and the dirty jokes of the jailers whistled in their ears, making this simple bath a memorable experience they would not soon forget. Chapter 77 All ready to be sold. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After a long time that seemed interminable to them, and where the few who could not resist scrubbed and rinsed themselves in silence, the ordeal finally came to an end. All these people, having given in to their impulses, gradually emerged from their trance, and their dilated pupils and euphoric expression gradually gave way to shame and dread. About 30% of the slaves in the baths had resisted their impulses, but very few had done so with the stoicism of Jake and Will. To resist this kind of temptation, being intelligent was not enough. Otherwise all mentally handicapped people would be potential rapists and all geniuses would be virtuous. The real problematic factor was the hormonal changes exacerbating their biological desires and urges. To give a more telling example, if someone killed the most important man or woman of your life in front of you, you would naturally feel sadness, anger and rage. The desire for revenge would inevitably seize you, whether you are stupid or not. Normally, even the most intelligent and peaceful ones would want to take justice into their own hands. The law of Talion, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which has existed since ancient times, illustrates this precept. Now imagine if these emotions were amplified 10 or 20 times. Everyone would react like rabid beasts, until justice was done. The reptilian brain would totally dictate our behavior. The current situation was similar but driven by an entirely different desire. As such, Jake and Will could be described as strong-minded. Although Jake was once lazy and procrastinating, he was also an extremely stubborn person. In the same way that he hadn't dared a few months earlier to check out the women in the street, he could easily ignore the orgy around him. Scanning the debauched in search of people like him, he eventually noticed a few interesting individuals who stood out from the crowd. Yerode and Lamine, in spite of their strength, had absolutely not resisted this strong stimulus. The two former mercenaries were fornicating to their heart's content, happy to release their frustration from last night. Jake suspected them to be perfectly sound of mind, but considering the treatment of women in their group of criminals, this kind of practice might not be a first for them. Maybe they just decided to take advantage of the moment. The other possibility was that their intelligence might have suffered from the transformation into Thrasgenian, but it would be foolish to count on that. Idiotic and impulsive or not, they were still dangerous. 4 people fell into Jake's sights. The first 2 were a couple of Asians, probably Chinese. Possibly brother and sister. Unfortunately, they had never been good at differentiating between people from different Asian countries, and the world had become so cosmopolitan over time that it was a waste of time to determine nationality based on appearance. The Asian man was in his 20s, with a well-trained body reminiscent of martial artists. His face was rather banal, neither ugly nor beautiful, but not unpleasant to the eye. His hair was cut short, perhaps because of the confinement of the last few months on Earth. His behavior towards the young woman was extremely protective, watching every man approaching them with suspicion. The young woman accompanying him was extremely cute and of a similar age, perhaps a little younger. About 1.65 meters tall, her body was slender and well-trained as well. She had few curves, but these were not non-existent either. At least, from what Jake had been able to see by ogling her, she had nice tits and flawless skin with no moles or birthmarks. She seemed extremely stressed and worried, but not terrified. A third individual, Jake's size and typical Middle Eastern physique, but who could just as easily have been from North Africa, or any other country, looked sinister in stark contrast to the ecstatic looks of the fornicators around him. He seemed resentful of the whole earth and ready to fight at the first opportunity. Yet he continued to scrub himself meticulously with plant soap, ignoring the debauchery rampant all around him. The last one was much older, at least 50 years old. Even with the distinctive white hair of the Thrasgenians, he seemed to be of Slavic, Northern European or perhaps German origin. His long hair fell to his shoulders and he had a long, well-trimmed beard. He looked very much like a Viking. The way he scanned the crowd was similar to Jake's and was reminiscent of a seasoned military man. His expression and upright posture indicated that he was used to commanding men and being obeyed. Jake did not feel any panic or anxiety from him. Only concentration. Besides these 4 people, others resisted temptation as best they could, but none stood out like these people. When the general excitement ended and a silence of shame replaced the drunkenness of pleasure, their jailers stopped arguing with each other and started whipping them to wash more actively. A few minutes later everyone was perfectly clean, and the water in the basins had become completely opaque and cloudy. Soap and dust as well as other fluids had mixed with the clear water of the baths. Naturally, Jake, his group and other sane people had left the pools long before they became tainted by all those lecherous dimwits. The sad consequence was that these few people were much cleaner than the others, smelling of soap and already dressed in clean cotton tunics that matched their size, while the others had barely had time to rinse. In such a short time, a number had visibly failed to scrub all their dirt and still smelled a little bit. The latecomers had to stick to lower quality tunics, sometimes with holes and often not to their size. Jake didn't know if this would affect the rest of their ordeal, but being presentable was certainly a significant plus. In any case, some seemed to regret their actions, and despite the loss of intelligence, a good number were taking the full measure of their actions. Even Jake was reluctant to invest 16 of his 21 points from the previous night to increase his ether intelligence by 1 point. This would not restore his initial intelligence, but the effect would be visible on every cognitive function. Memorization, speed of information processing, calculations, visualization, orientation, semantics, comprehension, nothing would be forgotten. This was the advantage of ether stats over body stats. The former amplified the latter, while the latter were only an average arbitrarily calculated from different variables. In order to increase his body intelligence by 1 point, a marked increase in memory could be enough despite the stagnation of his other brain functions. In this respect, ether was much more reliable. All line up, you dirty Throstian primates. You've been allowed to fornicate like the beasts you are. Now we want obedience. The ugly, yellow-toothed jailer suddenly barked at them, his spit flying all over the place, including his teammates. Once the ranks were properly formed, they were escorted elsewhere, back through the inner courtyard of the insula patio to another nearby building. Inside, to the delight of their taste buds, a buffet awaited them. Even though they were from another world, the smells and dishes presented were familiar to them and everyone began to salivate. Jake recognized different poultry, several red meats, fish, and all kinds of fresh vegetables and fruits. Dark bread made from an unknown cereal was also available to them. You have an hour to fill your belly to your heart's content. After that, it's off to the main square of Helios to be sold. A meal like this may be your last, so I advise you not to waste this chance to fill your stomach. Another grumpy legionary standing guard inside the building explained the rules to them. No shoving, there'll be plenty for everyone. A few impatient men were rewarded with the bite of the whip when they rushed at the food without their jailer's approval. The orgy had apparently not taught everyone a lesson. Besides, someone who had already been an idiot before the ordeal was now unlikely to shine by his brilliant decisions and common sense. Jake and his group ate in silence, chewing the food slowly so as not to clog their digestive system. They preferred fatty meats and fish, vegetables and fruits to regain their energy instead of stuffing themselves with bread as some did. Jake was finally able to experience what great constitution and vitality truly meant. His digestive system was constantly releasing astronomical amounts of hydrochloric acid and enzymes that were breaking down food at all speeds. His teeth, strength and speed of chewing were also incomparable to that of the past. He devoured an enormous prime rib by chattering his teeth as if he was shivering, the piece of meat disappearing in a few minutes, bones included. The latter had simply tasted as crispy as potato chips. Once the slaves were all sated, the jailer cracked his whip again to re-form the ranks. The large group then set off once more, heading for the large Helios market square to be sold. Chapter 78 Helios Part 1 You're listening at novelfull.audio. When the group of Throstian slaves finally left the insula through the gate and the enclosure separating them from the outside, a sea breeze smell attacked their nostrils. The wind was lukewarm in spite of the early morning hour and they had to squint their eyes due to the sand and dust it lifted. The red sunlight of dawn also dazzled them after their days in captivity, but they all adjusted without any trouble. The insula was part of a complex built outside the city and owned by a famous slave trader. Dozens of other buildings like this one could be found all around the city of Helios, with a standing similar to that of horse or cattle farms. The human being was a commodity like any other and as such had to be warehoused. The insulas served this function. Seen from the outside, the insula was not as luxurious. Although the building had a recognizable antique architecture, the compound and the private guard standing watch gave it the appearance of a barracks. The outside of the town was a genuine pigsty, a place of poverty and misery. A water supply and waste disposal system had indeed been set up within the city of Helios, but of course this waste and sewage had to be disposed of somewhere. As such, the ocean was the solution of choice. Between the commercial port and the sewage treatment system, foolish would be the one bathing in the river cutting the city in two and joining the ocean a few kilometers further on. The aqueduct system was limited to Helios itself, and therefore the entire outskirts of the city was a veritable dumping ground where all kinds of smells were mixed, from manure to the cheap perfume of prostitutes. As they were slowly escorted to the large coastal city, Jake and the other slaves inquisitively observed the environment around them. This was all the more true for Earthmen like him who were experiencing their first ordeal. Now that it had begun, he had great difficulty determining whether it was some kind of virtual reality or a real world. Until now, everything seemed extremely real to him. The smells, the textures, the sensations, all his senses were completely deceived. Jake could not explain, other than through virtual reality, how the Oracle system could guarantee their survival, or by what miraculous process it changed their appearance and gave them a false identity. Being fluent in two languages that had been completely foreign to him just a few hours earlier were equally confusing. His instincts told him that he would not forget them once they were out of the ordeal. Another question mark. Apart from the main mission of surviving 2 months, he had absolutely no clues on how to improve the rating of his ordeal. So far, it only seemed to be an open world configured in sandbox mode. He had the feeling that no matter what he did during those 2 months, as long as he was alive at the end, he would pass the test. And yet, the Oracle had to have very specific criteria to judge their performance. It was up to him to find them. Which brought him to another obvious fact. The Oracle had confiscated all their possessions before the ordeal except for their Oracle device. He could always talk to she, even if she had never been much of a talker. The functions of his bracelet were of course still available, with his rank of private and the experience necessary to improve his authority level clearly displayed. So all he had to do was wish for how best to perform in this ordeal and the prediction ability would give him a path. But how could he be sure that this path would suit him? For example, becoming the new Imperator of the Mermid Empire could certainly be achieved in many ways. By coup, execution, war, or even marriage of one of his daughters, if he had any. The possibilities were wide. The perfect plan might require him to be so unscrupulous as to eliminate infants or sacrifice children to achieve his ends. Some people may have been able to perjure themselves to succeed in this ordeal, but Jake had his own boundaries. If he broke them, he would no longer be able to look at himself in the mirror. What do you think I should do? Jake asked her mentally while he continued to follow the other slaves. The real question is, why are you doing this ordeal and what is the purpose of the ordeal? If you know the answer, then what you have to do will come to you. She answered him in an enigmatic voice, before falling back into her customary mutism. Oh. In this case, it's simpler than I thought. He concluded, his lips stretching slightly to form a smirk. He was there to become stronger, and the ordeal served the same purpose. In other words, no matter what he accomplished in this new world, if he came out weaker or the same as when he arrived, he would have wasted his time. Nevertheless, simply surviving those 2 months couldn't be so easy as passively following the storyline set up by the Oracle for them. If they followed the natural course of things without interfering with events, he would be sold to the highest bidder shortly. If his buyer decided that he was an ideal beast of burden to work in the fields, he would spend 2 grueling months plowing, but he would have wasted his time completely. On the other hand, if he didn't disobey and proved so efficient that he was recognized by his new owner, he would certainly have a better rating than the one who would only do the minimum required. In other words, even a useless role could lead to different ratings depending on the way it was carried out. What was important was what was learned from this experience. There were certainly many other criteria, but he would only know them when he finished this ordeal. The rating scale for the ordeal was one of the things Cho Min-ho was prevented from revealing to them, explaining that providing them with this information would be sanctioned. So the first ordeal wanted them to solve this mystery on their own. Oh, whatever, Jake thought. My goal was always the same. His path, I want to get stronger as fast as I can, was still in effect. His second path, I want to live, was also perpetually active. These were rather selfish desires, which many shared, but few of them were pursuing these paths with the same fervor as Jake. Once he reaffirmed his convictions, the coaching function began again, triggering the opportunity he had been waiting for. Side mission. Show your value, you will soon be auctioned off in the great market square of Helios. Find a way to show that you are different from the other slaves. Hint. The talent you display will greatly influence the rest of your ordeal. Rewards. Better rating, experience points for authority level, risks. Injuries/death, to be sacrificed. Probability of success. High, probability of failure. Very low, the content of the mission did not shock him in the least until he reached the risks part. The probabilities of success and failure were the counterpart of each other, but neither could be ignored. Real life was not a Manichaean world and neither were the consequences of his actions. He could not really fail to prove his worth. He could show some strength or character, that would be enough to accomplish this mission. In that sense, he had a good chance of getting the rewards of this quest. However, the small chance of failure indicated that he could naturally fail to show his worth, but more importantly, it could easily backfire. The risk of being sacrificed was particularly worrisome and gave him the creeps, as he didn't know what it meant and why. Of course, these probabilities were of little value. Without any digester present to load the dice, the oracle's ability to forecast was all powerful. If he imitated his shadow guide perfectly, he could not fail. He hadn't improved his agility for nothing. If Jake had confidence in one of his qualities right now, it was his ability to sync up and mimic his shadow guide. Meanwhile, the slave party had reached the city wall of Helios, after wading down a dirt road wide enough to drive 2 chariots side by side. The dry earth mixed with horse dung and all sorts of excrement, making the ride in sandals particularly unpleasant. The humans they passed by on their way were often slaves like them, coming from different countries conquered by the Mermid Empire. Under the supervision of their owners or a foreman, they worked like ants at the task for which they were destined to slave until their death. The sun was already high in the sky when they reached the city wall and they could now enjoy a better view. Dozens of carts full of goods were waiting for the great gate to open, eager to do business inside the city. They could also glimpse as far as the eye could see fields of an unknown cereal, probably the source of the black bread they had eaten, as well as all sorts of buildings like the one they were confined in. A few villages were visible not far away, probably under the jurisdiction of the coastal city. Under the escort of the legionnaires the group of slaves passed through the security checks without a hitch, the centurion inspecting them seemingly extremely familiar with their jailers. After exchanging a few banalities with the slavers, he let them circulate with big hand signals. Chapter 79 Helios Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. The wall of Helios was about 6 meters high, made of yellowish tough stone with a crumbly aspect. From the outside and combined with the grime and poverty of the immediate periphery of the city, it looked as though it was an inconsequential harbor city. Yet the interior conveyed a very different image. Farewell to the friable volcanic tuff, which was replaced by good brick, marble or granite as far as the eye could see. Jake was not a specialist in ancient Rome or Greece, but he did understand why this ordeal was categorized as peplum. Inside the walls, the dirt road was now paved with regular flat stones, slightly swollen in the middle to allow rainwater to drain away. About 7 meters wide, it was a major thoroughfare where thousands of Myrmidian citizens were teeming to carry on their activities. Several times their cohort of slavers had to move aside to make way for patrols of legionaries armed to the teeth, chariots or stagecoaches of important nobles whom they could not offend, or a messenger rider galloping and whipping his horse without mercy. The districts on the outskirts of the city were definitely poorer than the large white marble buildings in the heart of Helios. They passed numerous brothels, stalls and other inhabited areas, where despite the neatness of the place the misery was still very apparent. In any case, the water system was incredibly well developed and provided water to every nook and cranny of the city. These stone and brick structures were extremely imposing and striking, supplying the majority of residences, thermal baths and other public places. Several of them also served as bridges connecting the 2 sides of the river that cut Helios in half. The river in question, according to the few stone panels he saw and could read perfectly, was named Illa and flowed into the Balian Ocean. Almost all the major cities of the Mermid Empire, including the capital Myrm, were built along this river, which gave the Mermid territory its endless winding snake-like shape. After about 2 kilometers, they reached one of the aqueduct bridges crossing the Illa River and leading them to the center of Helios. The river was about 100 meters wide and was divided in two around a central islet about 800 meters in diameter, which had become the commercial and political heart of the city. Even before crossing the bridge, the standard of living of the people living near the river had increased significantly. Citizens were wearing clean tunics, many of them having their own escorts or slaves wearing sedan chairs. The women were elegant and wore dresses of various warm colors sewn with silver and gold thread. Many carried ostentatious signs of wealth such as jewelry, brooches, necklaces and earrings with enough value to feed many of these poor suburban citizens for life, yet crime was almost non-existent. Low enough for these noble and wealthy merchants to dare to walk these mundane streets with only 1 or 2 guards. Here, the alleys were clean and the facades of the buildings often painted or sculpted on stucco, a kind of lime with sand. Marble. Like powder equals cheaper than marble. These often represented famous battles or even more often the hero Mermid and his exploits. In addition, they came upon more than one altar or small temple of contemplation with a statue of the latter. There were also other temples honoring other figures, but these were often much more modest in appearance. Clearly, the Mermid Empire only supported the worship of its greatest hero. Once they passed the checkpoint at the entrance to the aqueduct bridge, they reached the central islet, the heart of Helios. There, only huge buildings of sparkling white marble and impeccably maintained gardens awaited them. An amphitheater on their left, a gigantic temple on their right. And then a little further on, the forum accompanied by a gigantic complex of basilisks surrounding the famous large market square to which they were heading. At the promixity of the temple, several palaces overlooked the city, protected by their own ramparts, often higher than that of Helios itself. The city's main barracks provided security for these politicians, nobles and religious priests of great importance. Without the slightest pause or hesitation, their jailer continued to lead them to the main square with a sure step. As they approached, they could see many groups of slaves escorted like their own, the ladders coming from different aqueduct bridges. These slaves were not always Thrasgenians like them, their appearances and skin colors being extremely varied, much more so than on Earth. Most of them were brought by ship to the Helios dock, which they had seen at the same time as the Balian Ocean when they crossed the aqueduct. Once on the large market square, which was a huge paved plaza about 100 meters in diameter and already full of potential traders, sellers and buyers. A wooden platform was erected in the middle of it and an old man in a white tunic, sandals and gray hair was standing there. A first lot of about 20 slaves was standing behind him, waiting to be sold. Jake recognized in the eyes of some of them the foreign and vigilant gaze of earthlings participating in an ordeal like him. It was easy to tell when someone was consulting his oracle device. The gaze would become empty and the eyes would seem to be staring at some point in the void or would quickly shift from right to left as if in full reading. Not everyone reacted this way, however. Either the loss of intelligence had been too severe, or they were natives of this world. Those who had downcast faces or on the contrary were carried by a vindictive rage could only be aborigines. Some of the participants had obviously been more fortunate than they were. The race in which their bodies had been altered was different from theirs, and some of them had obviously retained their intellect intact. Jake could, however, discern some patterns in these fortunate few. These lucky ones were often elderly or had body language and personalities that showed a certain amount of self-confidence. Their gestures were safe and their hands were graceful or on the contrary calloused. They probably had skills or talents that would have made the loss of their intellect more detrimental than anything else, preventing them from showing their full potential. Another possibility, of course, was that they had simply been lucky. The luck factor certainly existed. By punishing them so randomly from their first ordeal, the oracle was teaching them that ordeals were unpredictable, just like the mirror universe. The fact that they were now vulgar slaves about to be sold could as well be a reminder that it was the fate that awaited them in 5 years' time on B842 if they were not able to raise their oracle rank or ordeal number sufficiently. Of course, he was speculating. Cho Min-ho's first ordeal had nothing to do with theirs. Over the next hour, the main square continued to fill up more and more, as the Heliodian citizens who went there were increasingly wealthy and influential. The slavers and their slaves waiting to be sold had to make up their minds to leave the plaza until it was their turn. A centurion and his legionaries kept order, calling the slavers one by one when it was their turn to sell their goods. Very high dead-end slaves could be sold in one of the auction basilicas, but a special permit was required to get there. This permit was usually only given to official Myrmidian generals or recognized Myrmid warriors. Their jailer in legionary attire, with his ugly face and yellow teeth, certainly did not have this privilege. He had to be content to wait patiently for his turn like a wretch. These Thrasgenian slaves, which he had obtained cheaply and most of whom should not have lasted long, had miraculously regained strength, their vitality suddenly worthy of the best Myrmidians. And it was not to displease him. It meant more money. And money, he liked that. Jake and the other slaves were able to watch from afar with some apprehension as several lots of slaves like theirs were auctioned off, allowing them to learn a few things. Well-built men and pretty women were sold for a minimum of 10 gold coins, enough to live sparingly in the slums of the city for a good year. Outside, probably double or triple, but security was no longer guaranteed. Elderly people, children or ugly women without any particular handicap sold from 3 gold coins and rarely more than 7. The handicapped rarely sold, and often cost more to feed them than what they could bring back in labor to their buyers. Next came slaves with special talents or recognized skills. The initial auction price could vary widely. Exceptional slaves, such as princesses from another country, elite warriors, or exceptional beauties, almost never appeared in such auctions in the public square. After a long wait that made their feet hurt so badly that the unfortunate slaves who had the nerve to sit down were whipped, their slaver finally heard his name. In a split second he changed his jaded and undignified expression to that of a subservient and pleasant salesman, and beckoned them to follow him to the platform. It was now their turn to be sold.